program or intervention were actually very much present. So we embedded in this survey the trauma screening questionnaire, which is a 10-item screener. And if you haven't yet encountered this, people were asked to indicate whether they'd experienced any of the following in the past week. Now again, this is not, all of this, of course, is tempered with some of the constraints, but these are adults reflecting back on their experience. And so there could be many things that had happened between their time of participation in the program and, the point when they're actually reporting this. But nonetheless, the fact that, over half of those who responded to this questionnaire actually met the threshold criterion for PTSD on this screener, to me that's really disturbing. And I think that, again, we have programs in this country. If somebody gets shot down in an airplane in, quote, enemy territory, not only have they been usually, I'm thinking in the military, sort of trained beforehand about how to, try to evade and resist and escape and deal with all of that. But even still, there's a debriefing and there's a process of restoration. And yet there are many youth who have attended these programs and have had these kinds of experiences and then are, quote, graduating, right? And then oftentimes returning either home or seeking to sort of move on with their lives and attend college. And I've had USF students come to me and say, oh my gosh, I read some of what you have written, or I've seen some of the work that's coming out of this group A-START, and have described their experience. And it just is, I'm so impressed that, that there are individuals who can have gone through this and then are, functioning in college and in work and in their life, because so much of it really does sound to me like what happens to prisoners of war and people who have been really significantly mistreated.
Did they happen to say how their relationships with their families are now?
Yeah, one of the questions at the end was to ask whether people felt like, you really tried to ensure that this wasn't a questionnaire that was biased, loaded with lots of negative, although when you throw like a trauma screening questionnaire in it, it sort of tips it. But asked, what was the best thing about the program, the worst thing? Did it help your family, and if so, how and how long? Did it harm your family, and if so, how and how long? And people did describe feeling like the relationships with their parents and their family members had been really compromised, and that was something that endured for a long time beyond, beyond their homecoming. Yeah. Some of the other questions that were asked were, would you go back? Would you want to go back? And would you recommend this program for others? And these are some of the things that people described. I still have bad dreams about it. I wake up shaking and nervous that I'm there again. It scarred me emotionally, and I don't know if I'll ever get over it. The program helped me realize what a sick, sad world we live in. I mean, those kinds of statements in terms of the existential consequences to me are really upsetting. And people saying, I was abused. I would never want anybody to be so horribly abused. And speaking to your point, I don't ever want another family to be torn up when there is the possibility of being reunited and healed. There are better ways to deal with a troubled teen than send them to a school that abuses kids. Okay, so many statements like this. Some of the caveats, obviously this is not, when you were asking, well, when did folks attend these programs, these are people reflecting back on their experience. And I am confident that there are many people who have had positive experiences, likely in some of these very same programs. And yet there were hundreds of people describing very distressing experiences. And again, it's a different thing to reflect back versus to give an account when you're actually either living the experience or very close to the experience. So those are some of the caveats. And yet, you know, I think one of the things that we tend to do in social science and traditional social science is that we pay attention to the mean, right, the average, sort of the thing that's true for most. And, you know, I like this quote that scientists tend to place too much focus on averages, while the world is full of singularities and much of the real world is controlled as much by the tails of the distributions as means or averages, by the exceptional, not the commonplace, by the catastrophe, not the steady drip. So I had this opportunity after this came out to testify before Congress in relation to that legislation that George Miller was proposing. And one of the points I made was that, you know, child abuse is something, if we think about how we respond as a society when we are concerned that it's happening in a family's home. You know, it is the ethical and the legal responsibility of teachers, of mental health care professionals to respond and to ensure that that gets investigated and to ensure that kids are safe and protected, right? And this is not happening in this case, right? These may be exceptions, but when there are hundreds of exceptions and there's not a response, then we are in very troubling circumstances, it seems to me. So this is just, you know, a point that one of the respondents made, you know, and as I said earlier, there was the program director who was saying, you know, these are just a few noisy complaints. And so this guy says, okay, you know, I have a good idea of what you may be or may not be thinking at this point. You know, this guy is just some defiant little bastard who hates the world and sees everyone and everything negatively. Understandable, but whether you'll believe it or not, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm not just some pissed off kid who wants to whine. I'm a highly intelligent, well-educated, and responsible citizen, and as such a person, I know very well that my rights were totally and completely denied. Okay, and to me that is a pretty exquisite articulation of what account after account we're communicating in this online survey. So, you know, I think then what it raises is, okay, so if there is such a pattern of harm, and I would say, yes, we have now a pattern. It's not necessarily to say it's true for all, but there's a pattern here, a coherent pattern. Then, you know, relative to complexity, we think, well, what are all of, you know, what is that web of human decisions and actions that are actually producing this harm and perpetuating this harm? And then what are the environmental circumstances and conditions that are contributing? And if we can begin to better clarify that, then we may be able to figure out what kinds of decisions and actions could be taken in response. And I think one of the things that has been quite an education for me is, you know, this is what, so we started in 2005, and even still none of this legislation has actually sort of passed and made a difference, right? There are a few states that have got state regs and rules now. But, you know, just as we would say, you know, you don't have a safe community if you have lots of police. You know, police can be a deterrent to crime, but they cannot generate safety, right? The same is true with any kind of policies, right? They can be a deterrent, they can create some parameters, but they cannot generate nurturing, therapeutic, safe environments for kids. And so some of the things that it seems to me we need to think about as a broader community and as a community of different disciplines as well is that some of the things that seem to be contributing to this sort of tremendous growth of this nouveau institutionalization. One thing is that there has been decreased availability of traditional residential treatment. Now that's not to say that we need to just have a lot more of that now, but that many families have described that as different residential facilities have closed, their own communities have not simultaneously been able to keep up with ensuring that there are available community-based options for their families that are working. There's increased receptivity to these alternatives. You know, I think that there is, you know, we are in an era where you know, whether you're into spa treatments or you're into, there's a sort of there's a healing philosophy right now that I think these programs tend to capitalize upon in terms of talking about these environments being more sort of more natural and And actually, as I say that, some of the programs really take more of that like therapeutic wilderness kind of a perspective, and others are much more like we're just about accountability and